Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of PRAXIS webinars. We'll just wait a few moments while we have everybody join us. We've got all of our panelists here. We've got a fantastic array of guests today, and we've got some great discussion planned. So we're really looking forward to having this conversation. Whilst we're waiting, can I ask that all of your questions today to the panel are posed through the Q&A function if you are able to access Q&A. If not, then chat is fine, but we would prefer them to be through the Q&A so that it's easy for us to collate and respond. Can I also ask that you name the panelist you'd like to direct your question to? And that way, if we should run into any timing related issues, because we do have a lot to get through today, then we can direct our questions back to those specific panelists. So we will just wait a couple more minutes whilst the numbers climb. All right, we might just get started and people will join as they are able. So again, welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here, and we really do appreciate you joining us for another one of our sessions. And as always, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we gather and work on wherever you might be across the country, and we pay our respects to and acknowledge their connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and future. We'd also like to again mention our generous sponsors that have made this webinar series possible, and we will be continuing to run these for the remainder of 2020, and that includes the New South Wales Government Office for Health and Medical Research, MTP Connect, Sophie Mepham GCP, Health Translation SA, and the SA Health Medical Education and Training Unit. So a little bit of housekeeping, because this is a webinar-based format. Your videos will all be off as the audience members, and your microphones will all be off. So we do want this to be as interactive as possible. So please do use the Q&A to ask your questions. And as we mentioned, if you could please list the panelists that you'd like to address your question to. And that way, if we do run out of time, we can ask our panelists to respond to those questions offline. There will also be a short survey that we will send out to everybody that has logged in today. And we really do appreciate if you could return it. It's just an online survey. It just helps us to understand how we can improve our services. So we'd really appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to complete that and send that back for us. So today's session is around disruption, adaptation and adoption. And what does the new face of clinical trials look like? And there's a disclaimer up on the screen just to make sure that it's clear to the audience that our panelists here are not necessarily always representing the views of the organisations they work with. Some of their opinions may be their own, and that we always recommend that if you have questions specific to the conduct of your clinical trials, that you speak to your sponsors or your sponsor representatives, your HREC or your RGO, for specific advice. And of course, participants and staff safety and welfare is always our paramount concern when we're thinking about the way we need to adapt and modify clinical trials as a result of the environment that we're now operating in. So a quick word about our panelists today. So we have Ian Kerridge from University of Sydney, Royal North Shore Hospital, and one of our founding directors at PRAXIS. Kylie Sproston, CEO of Bellberry. Peter Kamoki, who is the Industry and Regulation Policy Manager at Medicines Australia. Tina Sullis from Neuroscience Trials Australia. Megan Ford from the Ingham Institute. Ben Laverty from IQVIA. Rebecca Tunstall from MTP Connect, Paul Christensen from Medtronic, and Wendy Keach from Health Translation SA. And we're really thankful to all of our panellists for taking the time to join us today and for all of the organisation that it takes to put a session like this on. So before we get started, there's a couple of polls, and these are really in alignment to the discussion today, and just to help us gather a little bit more information about what is working for you, what has changed, and the kinds of things that you really need some more support with. So let me go to our first poll. So I've just launched that. So this one is around the biggest challenges to clinical trial conduct. So we're asking you to nominate just one. So what is the most significant challenge you face with trial planning and conduct as a result of the impacts of COVID-19? We'll just give that about 45 seconds for people to respond. That's great. I think we're all over the polls. I've been watching webinars where they've been using Zoom and then been bringing in Mentimeter. And I sort of think, oh, it's just another complication. When the polls do work really well. Okay, let's just end that there and take a look at what the results are. Okay, so recruitment is the biggest challenge. So that we don't focus a lot on recruitment in today's discussion, but please do ask questions specific to your recruitment challenges in the Q&A panel, and let's see if we can find some shared information that will be helpful to you. The next biggest challenge is conducting on-site trial visits, and we will have some discussion around that in today's session, and interestingly that hasn't changed since we ran this our first webinar around this topic in March, and virtual monitoring remains a problem. So bear with me for a minute. All right, we're now going to go to our next poll question. And this is around the use of telehealth and other digital health technologies for clinical trials. So bear with me while I launch this poll. Doesn't want to take me to the poll question. No, I cannot get poll question 2 to launch, so we might just skip that because we do have a lot to get to. So Ian, I'm going to hand over to you now to do a little bit of an introduction for our audience around, from your perspective, what some of the challenges are as an ethicist, as a clinician, as a researcher, and so please feel free to go for it, Ian.
Thanks, Melanie. So, so I suppose what I'm just going to spend a few minutes doing a bit of scene setting, or probably a preamble is a better way to think about it. So just to again bring us immediately to COVID-19. So as of this morning, there were 22 million cases and 780,000 deaths around the world, 213,000 cases just in the last 24 hours. In Australia now we're up to 24,000 cases, more than 2/3 of which are in Victoria, and 450 deaths with the death rate of 1.9%. And there's staggering numbers, but the COVID-19 pandemic is in some ways not new, because it's very like other types of pandemic or epidemics in that it's exposed flaws or cracks in society. In the US, of course, what it's exposed is divides in terms of race and socio-demographics and access to healthcare. In this country, arguably, it's exposed well-recognised flaws in aged care, in mental health care, and in the management of homelessness. But it's also revealed strengths. And in terms of what we're talking about today, the strength I think it's revealed has been our strengths in the hospital system, in the public health system, and arguably also research. But it's also at the same time revealed some challenges and arguably some weaknesses as well. So maybe a few general comments about this. I think the first thing is it's fair to say is that we as a global community were not prepared for the disruption of COVID-19, either in terms of health system or in terms of clinical research. And that's despite the existence of pandemic plans in both in the research setting and in the health setting, is that COVID-19 has been a force majeure. It's created significant disruption and required adaptation and adoption of new approaches. And that challenge has been exacerbated by uncertainty. Uncertainty about natural history of this infection, uncertainty about the effectiveness of therapies, and uncertainty even about social distancing. And that's created significant differences around the country and around the world, and it's also led to pretty confused messaging. There's obvious precedents that I could point to there, but I won't name any names. For the most part, the Australian health response and the clinical trials response has been remarkable. It's been dynamic, it's been flexible, it's been responsive, and arguably I think it's also been ethically robust. But there's trade-offs, and I think many of you dialing in today will be aware of these trade-offs, because we have had to make decisions about trial continuation, termination or suspension, and similarly about continuing participants on trials or withdrawing them. And so that's required a really complex ethical thinking, I think, about the particular context of the trial, the necessity for the trial, the urgency of the trial, local contextual features, and participant and researcher safety. For the most part, I think those conversations have happened really effectively, and we've had time and calmness to do them. And luckily, we haven't had the same external pressures that they have in the United States and in Northern Italy, where they've literally had to think about, do we have the workforce to be even engaged in clinical trials or to be able to do this at all? So what have we done? We've made remarkable adaptations, reducing trial visits, increasing remote visits, increasing home delivery of products, increasing local blood draws and imaging, allowing remote data capture, and in some settings introducing e-consent. Many of those have actually been welcomed, and it's clear that the advantages they bring will probably persist beyond COVID, whenever that is. It's not going to be any time soon, but whenever it is, it's likely that these things will persist because they reduce costs, they reduce time, they increase convenience, and they reduce risk. And there's emerging evidence that trial participants really appreciate many of these interventions. Similarly, in the context of thinking about research itself, and I'll say a little bit about this to finish, is that it's accelerated new thinking. And in some ways, this is the more significant thing, is it certainly changed conduct, but it's changed thinking about trial design. So predefined platform trials, large adaptive trials with easy enrollment, minimal data collection, and clear endpoints already in the COVID space have really changed the way we're thinking about this. So I want to finish though by saying is that it's exposed ongoing challenges in the research sector. I'm just going to mention a few. The first is that it's raised the problem of exceptionalism. So in other words, how we quickly adopt or make easier trials, but potentially lose data integrity and therefore ultimately lose knowledge. The obvious example of this is the Surgisphere debacle, where retraction of the various papers was only marginally less fast than the desire to publish them. And what was remarkable about that, of course, is that it was a new way of doing data. It was using cloud analytics of dubious hospital real-world data collection for secondary analysis. And ultimately, it appeared to be fraudulent in many different ways. The second is that COVID has exposed both the benefits of collaboration and the absence of it. So just a quick look. On the 1st of June, I could find 1,700 COVID studies registered around the world, 190 of which were on hydroxychloroquine, 50 of those were in the US, and almost all of them were single-arm, single-center, and underpowered. So it exposes significant problems with duplication and with poor research design. And the last thing is that it's exposed the need to still take account of ethical concerns. So if we move to reducing data points and reducing visits and using e-consent, is that we still have to come up with ways to ensure privacy and confidentiality, and importantly, integrity of data. So the challenge then, and what the discussion today is about how we critically analyse the changes, the challenges and the adaptations in the research sector as we go, because we can't do this when we finish, we have to do it now contemporaneously. So we have to ask what's working, what's not working, what challenges remain, what changes will and should stay with us, and lastly, what is actually changing, or are we still resistant to significant change, particularly in the use of technology? And I'll finish there.
Thanks, Ian. That was a fabulous overview of some of the broader questions in relation to what has changed or what should change. And we're going to get into some of the detail around what has actually changed. But these are really important discussions. And as you said, it's important that we are having these discussions now and that we don't just reflect later. We'll obviously need to do a lot of reflection later, but now is the time where we can bring change and where we should all be embracing it. And we are working together better than we ever have before, but certainly there's more opportunity to improve that and diminish the level of waste in research, which you've just alluded to. So now we're going to go over to our panel, and this first question is for Rebecca from MTP Connect. So Rebecca, what is the net known impact of COVID on the sector and specifically on clinical trials?
Melanie, and I think Ian's given a really good overview of where we're at with COVID and the bigger picture as well. In terms of MTP Connect, as we're the growth centre for Australia's medical technology, biotechnology and pharmaceutical sectors, we've been closely monitoring the impacts of COVID on Australia's MTP sector. So in June, we actually published a COVID impact report which documented the impact of COVID-19 on the MTP sector for the period of May up to May, so the early period of COVID impact. And so we actually had input from over 80 executives across the sector, as well as input from an online survey. So what we saw in this initial period was a strong negative impact on the MTP sector, as we have across the Australian economy. And that has really depended on which part of the value chain that these organisations were working in, whether it be basic research, preclinical research, clinical trials, or manufacturing and sales. So the organisations with the greater emphasis on early stage research and preclinical R&D were more negatively impacted than those organisations in later stage trials or commercial activities. So, and the highest overall impact, negative impact, was seen in research institutes and pharma and biotech. And you'd all be familiar with the impact that you've seen personally in your roles and organisations. And the most significantly imported impacts on these research institutes and large pharma and biotech noted was similar, and that was around an inability to conduct existing clinical trials and source participants for new trials, which is certainly a common theme. So as Ian's already highlighted in terms of the need to put measures in place around social distancing requirements and imposed on hospitals and patients and making sure that they were safe, that certainly has been a challenge which you'd all be aware of. And nearly 60% of the survey respondents actually indicated that their ability to conduct clinical trials was severely impacted. So while some areas may not have been as impacted, organisations who are working on, say, respiratory or infectious diseases, having to continue those trials, some companies reported up to 90% of their trials were actually impacted as well. So I suppose the other aspect is that the impact on smaller companies, so smaller biotech organisations, they've been impacted because of delay or reduction in funding, which has impacted their ongoing R&D efforts more so than larger organisations. So their need to actually preserve cash in this period meant that they weren't able to continue their research programs, and this has significant impact and implications moving forward when they look to complete their clinical trials when they can resume. So it has an impact on retentions of jobs in the sector as well. So I suppose it just reiterates in terms of what you've been seeing across the board. And we're currently undertaking a preparation of a second report, which is an updated report on the impact and a forward-looking view of the road to recovery and what actions need to be put in place to support the sector and support jobs in the sector. And certainly clinical trials is a key opportunity involved in that, and it's an opportunity for us to strengthen, use our great reputation in clinical trials and leverage that moving forward. So I'm looking forward to the discussion of the panelists today as well.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. That was going to be my question, is when is MTP Connect planning the next sector analysis? So thanks for answering that. All right, on to our next question. And this is to Peter. So what are the opportunities for clinical trial improvements in Australia now and post-COVID-19, if there is a post-COVID-19, including between industry's collaborative efforts with governments and research institutions? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you for that, Melanie, and thank you to the previous speakers. I think you've provided me quite a good platform to leverage off. And in response to this, I guess I have a rather positive, maybe overly positive, rose-tinted coloured vision of the clinical trials sector post-COVID, or whatever our new normal in a COVID world is going to look like. And that vision encompasses Medicines Australia members, obviously the larger pharmaceutical sector, but also as part of the R&D task force, which includes industry representative from Oz Biotech and the medtech sector. We are all working together to grow the industry, to come out of COVID stronger and better, having adapted to the challenges that have been put before us. And I think we're doing it very well. And obviously it's hard, and it'll be hard going forward. But I think we're meeting those challenges. And government is as well. And I say that because I work quite closely with government. So a vision for me of the clinical trials sector, or the R&D sector, is one where investment continues to grow in the sector. I know Medicines Australia members alone contribute some $1 billion worth of investment into clinical trials every year. And that's just my part of the sector, and obviously it's much bigger. So I see a future where brand Australia is internationally recognised as a premier clinical trials destination. And that is something that we can all work together on as an industry by being better at what we do, but also working with government to make sure that government spreads that message, and that message of that we're open for business, because we've been hit by COVID, particularly at the moment in Victoria, but other parts of the country are continuing clinical trials. And even in Victoria, folks are continuing their clinical trials where possible. So I see a future where we have a brand Australia that represents a harmonised system across states and territories of ethics and governance approval processes, which is something that we're working towards. Greater take-up of teletrials, greater take-up of remote monitoring, and all of the opportunities that we have to use the digital platforms that are becoming increasingly available to us across all sectors and across all industry. I hope to see an economic recovery in this country that is R&D led, that's innovation led, that's health led, in order to strengthen not just our clinical trials sector, but which in turn makes clinical trials part of the standard of care, part of the health infrastructure in Australia, to make folks want to come here for their healthcare, as well as so it becomes an export opportunity, as well as the foreign investment, the domestic investment, and the government investment that comes into Australia for clinical trials. So that's my rosy picture. It will take hard work to get there, and I am optimistic, from not least because of what I've seen across the sector, and as I've said, and as already been said, folks are adapting very well. And for example, on the remote monitoring front, access to electronic medical records remotely is something that is being taken up more and more widely. Yes, there are some IT infrastructure problems where I think certainly on the public front, some cooperation with government and government investment is required. And I'm hoping that they're looking at that. Certainly from an industry perspective, clinical trial sites are looking at that. They are implementing it. They are developing it. From our point of view, we are, as in Medicines Australia, but also through the R&D task force. So again, that broader membership that I mentioned, are working with SEBS, the Southeastern Border State Government Committee, to develop some clauses to be put into the clinical trial template agreements that are on our website and on others that are used by our industry, and to include remote access arrangements into that rather than a separate schedule. So it becomes part and parcel of how contracts are signed and how clinical trials are established. On the teletrials front, we're also developing a standard teletrials subcontract between institutions and the satellite sites, which is something that's been on the cards for a while. I have a draft agreement on my desktop that I'm working on that we will also hope to get through SEBS and have an industry-wide agreed template to work off. And like I said, we're also working very closely with government, and the Health Minister has made announcements about a one-stop shop, ethics harmonisation. There's work underway through the Australian Commission on Health, the Safety and Quality in Healthcare, who are working on a certain accreditation clinical trials program. So the clinical trial sites are accredited to a particular standard. And that pilot will hopefully get underway. I know it's been put off till September because of COVID, but that work is ongoing, and that is not a project that's going to go away. So I see a great deal of potential there for further harmonisation, streamlining, and subsequently the ability to get clinical trials up and going faster, quicker, to help with recruitment, and subsequently allow for us to be able to market ourselves overseas so that we get more clinical trials into Australia, more new drugs, new treatments, and so on, which again, like I said at the beginning, will strengthen our infrastructure, create more employment, better our expertise, and allow for our smaller SMEs, startups to grow as well, because they will have great opportunity to be able to access.
Yeah, thanks.
And
Pierre,
on that note, I will finish. Thank you.
That's a great summary, and I guess there's many people in the audience today who will feel a sense of relief that there are these discussions that are going on in the background that they're not necessarily privy to, but that they can get an understanding that things are changing and that there are practices and processes being put in place to enhance that streamlining, as you mentioned. All right, the next question is for Megan. So Megan, what systems, processes or technology have you implemented locally that is helping you to build long-term resistance across your clinical trials networks?
Thanks, Mel. So just to give you an overview of what my role is at the Ingham, I look after the clinical trials for not just the Ingham, but also Southwestern Sydney LHD. Yes. So we've got around about 550 clinical trials running. And what we've actually tried to do is not just build resistance, but build resilience in both operational resilience and behavioural resilience. So we've kind of taken those as our two pillars that we have looked at. And I guess from an operational resilience perspective, one of the first things we've had to do is really have a robust business continuity plan in place around looking after the welfare of our patients, the participants in clinical trials, their family members, and our staff members. And that has led to us really having to look at all of the processes we have in place and overhauling a lot of our SOPs and adapting and adopting new systems from a technology point of view. So we have taken up teletrials very, very significantly in southwestern Sydney. And as much as possible, we have tried to keep our participants out of the hospitals, particularly at the moment where southwestern Sydney does have community-acquired COVID. And I think for our colleagues in Victoria, they understand this entirely. We need to be able to manage patients and participants really closely, but maintain their safety as well. So we've done things like introduce televisits. We have put in place the ability to be able to home deliver medications. We have alternative lab vendors set up so that we can do labs, ECGs, and those procedures outside of the hospital setting. And this is something in public health that is quite unique. Of course, you have to work with your sponsor, and you have to ensure that you've got the right agreements in place to be able to maintain patient safety. But this is something that we've put in place that can continue in the long term and allow us to run remote clinical trials. I worked for IQVIA previously where there was a lot of talk about not having sites involved in trials, and it was a little bit pie in the sky. But now it's actually something that we can do because we've had to be reactive. We've had to put processes and procedures in place to be able to do this. So it's actually something that I think as we're moving forward, we can work with sponsors to take the patient as the centre and actually make sure that whatever we're implementing for a clinical trial is actually something that for them is going to be attractive. We've also introduced a lot of new systems. So our first electronic system that we've introduced is an electronic investigator site file. And we did that and we piloted that with the COVID-19 clinical trials, and it worked extremely well. It meant that we could share source data with our sponsors. It meant that everybody had access to the to all of the documents, no matter where they were based, because we had to have a lot of people, of course, home based. And it meant that we had a central repository of documents if we had the situation where our staff members were redeployed. And that did happen to us in the first wave, and it's happened again in the second wave. And so being able to still conduct the clinical trials and do the visits and have the patients being either remotely seen or seen in the hospital setting was really essential. In terms of recruitment, which is something that people have raised, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for sites and for sponsors as well, in that we don't want to bring people into a situation that might put them at risk. And that's particularly relevant for those who are immunocompromised or have some comorbidities. And so we have seen a reduction in recruitment into most of our clinical trials, about 80%. And so by doing risk management and actually identifying which studies we can continue to work with, but also finding alternative venues that we can actually see those patients has been really effective. And we've managed to use community centres, we've managed to use the private hospital that we have in southwestern Sydney to actually ensure that we can continue to see patients and keep our recruitment going. And then from a behavioural resilience piece, I think this is probably one of the biggest pieces that we've also worked on. People, the collaboration that has happened as a result of COVID-19 is quite phenomenal at a local level, an industry level, and a government level. I think it's actually brought people much closer together. It's removed some of the silos that we've seen. It's helped people think really innovatively about how we can do things. And we've seen a lot of really, really innovative ideas come out of the current situation. We also, at the Ingham in Southwestern Sydney, we've brought things in to be a centralised approach. And so what we've done from a behavioural resilience piece is we've actually had the leadership there to be able to help people have somebody they can call on, they can talk their problems through in terms of how to continue the clinical trials, which has meant that we've been able to maintain recruitment, we've been able to maintain bringing new studies on board where appropriate, but we've also maintained patient safety. So I feel very confident that these things are happening not just within my environment, but they're happening across Australia. And so that's all building that operational resilience and the behavioural resilience that we're going to need moving forward, because this is a long way from being over.
Thanks, Megan. And it's very reassuring to hear that you've been applying teletrials and using it so broadly across the across your particular region. I guess there's some questions there around accessibility, but I think what I love most about what you just said is thinking about setting up alternate sites where patients can go to outside of tertiary hospitals where risks are lower. You know, that's a really practical idea and something great to share. So let's keep moving because we still have a lot to get through. So Kylie, over to you. What key differences do you see in HREC applications in the ongoing COVID environment?
Thanks, Mel. And actually, that's a really nice segue, I think, from what Megan has just been talking about. I think in response to this question, I'd identify five categories, five features. The first, really, talking to Megan's point, is the kind of sector-wide culture change that we've seen in adaptability, flexibility, and the use of technology. You know, many of the systems that we're using today, you know, if we're honest, have actually been available for a number of years, but our sector, you know, has been somewhat conservative in terms of picking those up. And that's not surprising. I mean, even the global, you know, the global community really hasn't come to grips with VCs until this period. And now we're all, well, much better than we were before, perhaps. But so the first thing really, you know, as covered by Ian as well, you know, there is a long list of technology deployments and site flexibilities, study flexibilities that I could list, and Ian's covered well, so I won't go over them. But for us, I think that really signals this cultural change and adaptability. The second point I would mention would be batch processing. So certainly for Bellberry ethics committees, very early on in the piece, we put in place processes to enable batch processing, really anticipating that sites and sponsors would have, you know, significant numbers of changes, very similar changes to make across portfolios. So whether that's a site making the same, you know, face-to-face to teletrial change across their portfolio of open studies that are not necessarily connected to each other, or whether it's a sponsor that has one change to add to a protocol, but it runs across multiple sites. And that batch processing has been really well taken up by the sector, and it enabled us to process really a flood of COVID amendments, and from a site perspective, reduce the workload to about 10% of what it would otherwise have been without that batch processing pathway. The third point I would mention was managing consent. So it was actually really interesting to see that came up fifth on the biggest challenges in the poll, and certainly the ethics committees would concur with that. You know, the questions about how to robustly undertake consent, particularly if you're entirely remote. How do you conduct that robustly, and how do you then document that process? And the fourth item I'd mention would be, and again, this has been talked a lot about, so I won't, you know, labour it, is the move to remote monitoring. And I think this is another example where really we've seen COVID accelerate our adoption of alternatives. I know certainly for the Bellberry Human Research Ethics Committees, our usual face-to-face site monitoring program that we run every year, of course, has been now deployed as desktop auditing and remote site monitoring. And I know the same is happening at the sites. And then finally, the fifth item that I would put on the table, again, actually reiterates something that Ian Kerridge talked about. And, you know, I think our sector is absolutely in the spotlight right now. You know, the interest in our work and the output of what we do has never been greater, and it's never mattered more. You know, everybody across the sector is working with incredible urgency, but from the ethics committees, I guess we would caution. Everybody is working with urgency, but we're dealing with critical research when we talk about the COVID research in particular. You know, if we, of course, focus on the vaccine, you know, any effective vaccine is likely to go into the largest ever global immunisation event. I don't actually know that we'll, you know, have ever undertaken this kind of programme across the entire population at one time. You know, at that scale, we should prepare ourselves. Even low percentages of adverse events are going to be seen when we undertake that kind of process. And so, you know, when we look back at our sector, the standards that we work to, whether it's in GCP or GMP or regulation, those standards have been developed for a reason and on the back of, you know, a long history. Now is not the time to cut corners on that. And certainly we've seen a number of COVID protocols that really have been not yet sufficiently developed to take into practice. And that really reiterates what Ian Kerridge was talking about in terms of duplication, underpowering. And I think it's a classic example of where sometimes more haste is less speed. You know, the best thing that all of us can do to deliver on that sense of urgency is to make sure that we're applying ourselves robustly and with rigour to everything that we do.
Thanks, Kylie. That's fantastic. Some really important insights and thoughtful considerations there for how we need to consider what's important as we move forward in regards to research priorities. So let's go to our next question. Bear with me. All right. Did I go one too far? No, let me go back. Sorry, excuse me, everybody. All right, Tina, over to you. So what have you experienced so far in terms of sites and projects moving to teletrials and telemedicine? And in your opinion, is this going to continue beyond the COVID period?
Thank you. Thank you everyone, Melanie and everybody for joining today, and the panel so far for being such a nice preface to what I'm also about to say. I want to also preface what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, that some of this is my reflections based upon the CRO perspective. We work in a global environment. 80% of the projects that we are involved in are on behalf of clients that are based outside of Australia, keeping in mind also that we make up 2% of the industry globally, but as we know, we have a wonderful opportunity here and contribute amazing things in Australia right now. And I'm very confident about the future. I think that we're on the precipice of good things, not falling over off a cliff. I think we have a fantastic opportunity in Australia to increase our capabilities and on the world stage and what we contribute. So I'm also going to preface what I'm going to talk about today with evidence, because I've been fascinated with the current situation, but also about the future and possibilities. So I've been doing a lot of reading, because our world is all about evidence-based. So I've been doing a lot of reading about studies done by Johns Hopkins and Tufts, and also by the Centre for Information and Study on Clinical Research. So what I want to say is, I want to talk about pre-COVID and post-COVID. So I think it's fair to say that pre-COVID, the way we were undertaking clinical trials, both in telemedicine, in patient engagement, was really, in terms of, we were using and we are still using very, very high complex designs. Execution of how we do clinical trials in Australia around the world was fragmented. Different coordination from different states, different countries around the world, and all of that on the basis of a very risk-averse industry, and also mixed patient engagement. If you look at the data on protocol designs, we know over the past 10 years, there's been an 86% increase in the number of endpoints. And if you look at the number, an average number of protocol amendments, in phase 1, it's about 1.8 protocol amendments, phase 2, 2.2 protocol amendments, phase 3, 2.3 protocol amendments. And there's data to suggest every single protocol amendment costs the study $3 million and 3 months extra timelines, okay? We also know that the data over the past 10 years that we collect from clinical trials is double. And we all are familiar with increasing, you know, before it used to be collect straight into the case report form. Now we collect, patients, you know, collect diaries, they collect patient reported outcomes, e-source, mobile health, those sorts of things. So what about patient engagement? We know that there's data to suggest that 84% of folks, and that's probably increased now, this was about April, know about clinical trials, they've heard about it. But that doesn't always translate into patient engagement and patient involvement in clinical trials. As people have said before, there's an underrepresentation of minority groups, and about half of the sites we work with don't end up recruiting. So it was a system that we need to fix. What I'm seeing is that we are definitely involved with teletrials, telemedicine. For example, we're currently undertaking a rollout of a study that will be totally done remotely. And that means that we were going to do e-consent, video consent, verbal consent. The patients themselves will be involved in real time. They'll be reporting data into particular setups, be that websites, be that you know, applications as well. We will be undertaking telemedicine visits with that. And that is the way that we see the future anyway. So I guess what I want to say about the future of clinical trials and telemedicine is that I guess this sense of urgency and also compassion will lead to hopefully a cultural mindset of the way that we do clinical trials, including telemedicine. Hopefully it will increase the speed and deployment of the way we do trials. Hopefully they'll be more adaptable. And what we've also seen is the increase in speed with working with the engagement of regulatory authorities. I've never seen regulatory authorities react fast as they have been with regards to review of designs of particular clinical trials, and particularly in COVID, of course, where we see FDA reviewing an IND application within weeks and getting that feedback really quickly so that we can then, you know, deploy it out to the sites as we need to. But even in Australia now, we are seeing the increase of patient advocacy groups in the design of the clinical trials. And that is expected now, whether you're applying for a grant through MRFF or whether you're applying to the FDA to open up an IND, we are seeing that there is expected that you have spoken to the patients that you're going to include in your trials, at least the advocacy groups, about what that design will look like. So I want to summarize also by saying, whereas we've seen an increase in complexity in clinical trials, I don't think that complexity is going to go away. But what we hopefully will see will be a master clinical trial, a way of doing things that's going to be almost like a master protocol platform, whereby it's going to be adaptable. We're going to bypass and speed up some of the processes that we're currently undertaking, whereby we are going to involve more than ever the patient and enable them to be involved in collection of their own data in a clinical trial. And the introduction and evolution of artificial intelligence and machine learning will hopefully mean that we can design the clinical trials more effectively and quicker and translate to getting these products on the market as soon as possible. So I might leave it at that because I could probably talk for the next half an hour. I'm trying to say, put all my notes into view and conscious of time. So hand it back to you, Melanie.
Thanks, Tina. And all of the panelists, we were all saying offline earlier that, you know, everyone could talk about all of these topics forever. And so we are trying to keep this truncated. But I'm going to pull out something you said around patient engagement and just address some of the questions that we've had. So Kevin's asked a question to the panel, and I'm happy for whoever wants to address this. But do the panel feel that the need for sites and sponsors to pivot and really actually focus on patients first is a silver lining from the pandemic? And do we believe that this focus will be sustained? Does anybody want to address that?
I'm happy to go first and say definitely it's a silver lining, and we are definitely seeing the regulatory authorities, our sponsors, making patients at the forefront of what we are trying to do, because ultimately we're trying to bring the medicines for that patient population group, right? So as I was just saying, we are seeing the development of the design of the clinical trial, the way we engage the patients to make them at the forefront of capturing their own data and being part of the whole process, and then making that collaborative with the regulatory authority, expectations with the advocacy groups, so that we're designing trials for the end user as well, is what I would like to say.
Great. And I guess my only comment there would be that with the advent and the uptake in use of technologies such as teletrials and telemedicine, we just need to be sure that we're not going to further marginalise populations who don't have access to these technologies. So I think that's something we really need to be considering when we're thinking about the adaptation of these technologies, and not just a blind application, but actually a very thoughtful consideration for the populations that we're serving. But Janelle's got a great question as well that goes back to recruitment, but also to community engagement. And she asks, if recruitment is such an issue, and I think we've definitely seen that, is there any thought in the future vision to how this can be addressed through supported infrastructure and community engagement? So how are we going to get better at doing this as a country, really? And who'd like to have a go at that one?
Mel, it's Meg. I think it's the perfect timing for this, to be honest with you, because we were in a situation where there is a lot of media about clinical trials, and it's a perfect opportunity for us to increase visibility of clinical trials, the understanding of clinical trials, and actually engage the community in the design and conduct of clinical trials. So I do think that it's a perfect opportunity. I'm not really sure that we are focused enough on that opportunity at an industry level though, and I think we probably need to be talking about that more so that we don't lose the momentum we have at the moment in the media that we're getting about clinical trials.
I would absolutely support that, Megan. And I think there are some fabulous work being done from international regions that we work closely with, and the UK is a great example. And so we don't need to recreate the wheel. We just need to look at best practice and think about how we can do that better. And now is the right time. And as you say, we should not lose momentum here because it's critically important. I've got one more question for you, Meg, actually, and it's a very practical question, and it relates to having the sites as alternate sources for conduct of trials. And how did you get around HREC and sponsor requirements to implement that as a strategy?
Yeah, so we had a lot of conversations with our ethics and governance committee about this before we implemented it, because we needed to ensure that they were on board and it could be done in a timely manner. And we also had the same conversations with our sponsors in parallel to make sure that it was something that was approved. So what we've done is we've added the venues under a service level agreement, which is what you require in the CTRA. And we've actually signed them up as locations for conducting visits. So they're effectively acting as a satellite site without being a satellite site. So, and I think there's a lot of confusion around what is a satellite site versus what isn't a satellite site. And I think at a industry level, it's something that we need to try and standardize and come up with a good, clear definition of what is satellite versus not. So we've done it all under a service level agreement where the LHD has a service level agreement with the facility. And that's really relevant in terms of the private hospital. For the community centres we've utilised, they're actually all part of the LHD. So what we've done is we've added them onto our contracts as a location where patients will be seen. We've been very practical about it. We haven't changed consent forms. If there is one study, so I should say we have changed the consent form because the sponsor wanted that. But in most cases, we haven't had to change the consent form because of the way that our consents are written, having an LHD approach to clinical trials. So it's actually worked exceptionally well. We had visits up and running within a week with this as a model, just because everybody was so engaging and coming back and answering our questions so quickly.
That's really impressive, and I guess it helps the fact that it's such a big and broad LHD, but I love the fact that you manage it as a service level agreement rather than having to add additional sites. That obviously streamlines things immensely and keeps it within the organisation and as an RGO issue. So let's keep moving, and let's go now to Ben. So Ben, what are the areas of accelerated clinical trial startup that can be taken from COVID-19 research studies and applied to future research?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Before starting, just want to say thanks for the opportunity today, not only to connect with everybody here, but as somebody who's been locked down in Melbourne for the last 7 weeks, to put on a shirt today was quite a nice change. So I guess starting off, when we looked at a number of COVID research studies and the fantastic outcomes that we've had in terms of accelerating startup, the bulk of it comes from early on commitment from all sides, and we've heard today a number of times around collaboration, but also flexibility and adaptability, and certainly a lot of hard work has resulted in us moving an average startup time from in the sector somewhere around 200 days being a good startup time to less than 60 days for pretty much all of these research studies. And that comes from taking some risks. So we talked earlier, Kylie mentioned we need to be careful around the corners that we're cutting when taking risk, but also certainly doing a lot of processes in line. And so we also need to be careful when it comes to the protocol and potential protocol amendments, that we're not going at speed to get something through initial approval only to find that we need to repeat 3 or 4 protocol amendments to get to the end result. So certainly it's not without risk, but the upside's huge, as I spoke about earlier. There's a real opportunity that we've proven our ability to accelerate startup. And I guess to call out a couple of key areas, one of those has been around protocol design. Certainly the COVID protocols are very straightforward in design, in that we've got specific endpoints. A lot of them are early phase, and so we're able to look at protocol templates that can be used and adapted across different scenarios. And I think we'll certainly see more of that coming through. We've also seen some really simple things that have made a big difference. And whilst face-to-face contact has been challenging, the ability to connect remotely, so to have remote ethics sessions, remote governance sessions, has actually accelerated a number of these meeting timelines and the ability to push it through. The other key piece of technology that I think has made a big difference across all trials has been the introduction of electronic signatures to contracts and agreements. And I think the fastest turnaround that we've achieved was less than an hour to have a contract fully executed. Again, not without a lot of hard work behind the scenes to make sure that that's all done in line. So yeah, we've certainly seen across the board around a 30 to 40 day improvement in our startup timelines, simply through technology and being able to push certain things through. What I will say is that it's intensive. So we talked about coming together and all parties coming together, and it's probably not sustainable to do that. Take that effort across all trials. But I think as an industry, we've got to challenge ourselves to look at specific key unmet medical needs. And I think the one that stands out for us in Australia is early phase oncology research, which contributes to a huge amount of the work that we do here. I think we probably need to challenge ourselves around having an expedited review process that we can all agree to for something as important as that.
Great, Ben, and it's really reassuring to hear how those technologies have impacted startup times, and let's just hope that there is an ability for us to maintain that momentum in some of those areas, although, you know, hopefully things like use of electronic signatures will change our practice and improve the way we do things. So now over to you, Paul. We're turning our focus to medical devices here. So medical device research sometimes requires the presence of proctors on site to provide case support. What were the impacts to device research, and what mechanisms were put in place to overcome these on-site visitation restrictions?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So, well, the impacts were devastating. So for a lot of our early phase research, where we do provide proctors in the labs where we're implanting devices, etc., we just closed those studies down to recruitment. I think we could have worked around some of that, but I think as a company, I think also, you know, as a sector, the device sector, I think we just chose to not complicate the issue and provide health authorities with some clear air to focus on what could have been, you know, a major impact to the health system. So we kind of just bowed out. But a lot of those proctors that we use either come from internationally or from interstate. So border closures, you know, really just ground a lot of our recruitment to a halt. So what we've done around that, now that we've started to get back in, is we are looking at some new technologies, especially around virtual presence. We're investigating the use of some things like View6 glasses or Google glasses. That'll almost give you almost an augmented reality presence, so that the physicians will wear these glasses in the room, and then remotely we see what they see. We can look at taking screen captures of stuff that they do, annotating some stuff if we want them to navigate to certain areas of anatomy to, you know, better place a device. We can do that all remotely. However, you know, large organizations often find it difficult to react promptly, and whether that's because of org structure or administrative and governance, you know, processes, we do find it hard to react promptly. So we have kind of fallen back to some of the maybe less cutting edge technologies. So we are doing things at the moment with things like, you know, just Microsoft Teams or whatever, still virtually, but just not, you know, the augmented reality that we'd hoped for. And look, you know what, the silver lining that people have spoken about is that, you know, it has forced us to adopt some of these new technologies that for various reasons, whether it be budget or, you know, we've not looked at in the past, and that's all gone away. And it's, you know, now that we're getting back into it, full steam ahead.
Sorry, I was on mute, just answering some questions offline. Thanks, that's really helpful. And I guess the medical devices sector is not something that this audience has particularly been having a discussion about, but a really key part of the Australian clinical trials environment. So it's interesting to hear what the impacts have been in that respect as well. All right, on to our next question, and this one's for you, Wendy. So what are the advantages, disadvantages or roadblocks to accessing technologies such as telehealth and teletrials to support clinical trials locally and across jurisdictions? And I don't think we have actually addressed this, so I think it's really important to think about what are the opportunities, but also what are the challenges?
Thanks, Mel, and I've got a few, and I'm sure the rest of the panel would probably have more to add. Look, as a translation centre, we aren't hands-on in clinical trials, but we have many connections to many trialists and people who are in the position to enable clinical trials. And I think that's what we've seen happen over the course of COVID, the enablement, trying to work out how can we keep things going. So to answer some of the questions for today, I actually reached out to some of the trialists that I'm working with, and some of the things that they mentioned as the advantages, disadvantages and roadblocks are the things that have already been identified. But I'd like to start with a few, and just to say that the general acceptability of using video conferencing, teleconferencing, and just generally using the techniques that we're all familiar with, including what we're using today, is probably the biggest change and the biggest thing that's really going to enable trials to be using this technology. it's become normalised, and that in a nutshell, it makes a big difference in terms of an advantage of what we're taking out of COVID. And the acceptability to actually put it into practice in a variety of ways, whether it's consenting, recruiting, interviewing, assessments, or administering interventions, it's all becoming part of what we can now do, and people aren't surprised or questioning whether this is okay. Certainly working in close collaboration with ethics committees and research officers, ethics chairs, to actually bring everyone along on the journey. It has been mentioned already, but this is some of the things that our trialists said that they actively did to enable changes to be made. And some really have talked about the COVID dividend, the silver lining, some people have mentioned. And the COVID dividend is one of the things is the e-consent, and being able to accept systems to have e-signatures and things, and some mentioned there's actually 4 different ways that now are quite normalised within the system to have electronic signatures being placed to enable e-consent, and this is being done in harmony with each of the ethics committees. The other thing that someone mentioned, which I thought was important, especially in the recruiting discussion we've had to date, is that the ability to use system like TrialFax, and I think that's one particular product, but to promote trials on the social media. And for some people, particularly those doing trials with pregnant women and with mums of 0 to 2s particularly, actually have done really well recruiting using social media into particularly, so placing ads in very specific markets, and they've had a great response. And in fact, the COVID dividend will be, they will be using these as recruiting strategies in the future, and they actually have been much more efficient than the ways that they typically were recruiting. So that was a very interesting revelation. In terms of difficulties and roadblocks, there's no doubt that the remote monitoring and doing physical assessments is actually an issue, but more and more the technology is coming through, and people have already mentioned the ability to do those physical assessments over video conferencing and using particular technological supports. So that's certainly been something that as technology improves, those things will be able to be done better and better. Certainly some of the things that have been a problem and a complete roadblock is when physical assessments weren't able to be done in a remote manner. And talking about one where people had to, they couldn't socially distance, they had to be in full PPE, etc. I'm sure many of you have many examples, but the limitations and the roadblocks about just not being able to do things. So there's no doubt sometimes technology isn't able to be the solution that does it. The other thing was the risk aversion from site-specific assessments and the governance structures in place, and really working through what is possible there. To do it. So just in conclusion, there actually has been great progress. The COVID dividend is real, and there will be things that will be continue to be put in practice by the trialists I've been talking to. And as the sophisticated technologies continues to work, more and more things will be able to be enjoyed. And really it's about creating an enabling environment to protect participants, to make sure things can be done efficiently, effectively, and in a transparent way. So I think there's a bunch of real opportunities like some of the other speakers have mentioned.
Great, thanks Wendy, and we really appreciate that input. All right, Rebecca, over to you. So in regards to innovations in technologies, what are we seeing in the sector that could help support clinical trials moving forward?
Thanks, Melanie. And I feel like quite a few of the elements that I was going to talk about have already been covered, which is fantastic. And I suppose I should also say that I'm coming from the perspective of having worked in clinical trials for a long time myself prior to joining EMTP Connect. And then I've come into a role where I'm actually having a better view of companies who are developing technologies on the ground, digital devices and things like that, which I haven't actually been exposed to previously in detail, but I was aware of them because we were trying to get them involved in clinical trials. But there was always some sort of bugbears and hiccups around that sort of thing as well. So I suppose it's and what we've been seeing is in terms of technologies as well, is that, as already been mentioned, in the general community, there's been an increased acceptance of healthcare professionals and patients around telehealth. And I suppose in terms of what the opportunities are, I suppose we've got the opportunity to adopt some of the technologies being developed, such as wearables, including sensors, smaller monitoring devices around physiological responses. Seeing how these are being incorporated into consumers, there seems to be quite a bit of uptake in terms of wearables and sensors and things like that. How can they actually be adopted and validated for a clinical trial setting to help these patients and participants in clinical trials be monitored remotely? Of course, it requires validation for clinical trials and regulation, but those types of technologies are being developed, and yes, we've seen moves to incorporate them into clinical trials, and they need to be validated for endpoints. But certainly those types of technologies are being developed, and there's a lot of opportunity in that space. I think, and I was going to mention e-signatures and e-consent as well, but that's already been mentioned. And I suppose it's sort of seeing an improvement in the platforms available, and as that's developed, things will get easier, I think, as these companies work on these types of technologies. And what was also mentioned already in brief was around AI being utilised for recruitment planning, retention, machine learning, natural language processing, and how that can be used to as well, because there's some great companies that are working on ideas as to how these can be incorporated into clinical trial design, and also seeing what types of patient populations would actually make sense for clinical trials as well. So predictive analytics and things like that. So I suppose what I've wanted to talk about has already been mentioned, but I think there's a great opportunity for some of the technologies being developed in general healthcare to be translated into the clinical trial setting with a bit of more refinement and uptake as well.
Yeah, and I guess it comes back to what Wendy said about having an adaptive and learning environment, and where we are in some respects learning as we go, because we're implementing and fast tracking that implementation. So it's really just being open to that adaptation.
Yes.
But I'm going to draw on a question from Karen, which harks back to what we've just been discussing. And it's about increasing efficiencies. And Karen's asked, with the implementation of new technologies and innovations, do we see a future where trials become more cost efficient, allowing for a greater number of sites to participate, and therefore facilitating access of clinical trials to more patients, and particularly in rare disease conditions? Would anybody like to address that? I think it's a really important question about if we're going to create more efficiencies, how can we use those efficiencies to increase trial access to a greater number of people?
I'm happy to take that one, Melanie.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, I certainly think that there is opportunities there. So I'll take it in two parts. But the first one was around increased efficiencies and cost effectiveness. Certainly if you look at the number of sites that are required to run a trial at the moment and the duration that takes and the cost of conducting research, then I think we all agree that there's plenty of opportunities for time efficiencies, and certainly in this game time equals money. So I think the challenges that we've got around time whilst we're accelerating things like startup is probably recruitment. So our ability to connect to broader patient populations and bring them into trials. We know that only about 5% of patients are offered clinical trials at the moment. So again, if we can use technologies to broaden our outreach, then we have the capability to do that. But at the same time, the challenge we have is that our model at the moment is site-centric. So we're only looking at a patient population centred around key sites. So certainly the opportunity by broadening things out, and whilst it presents some logistical challenges that we'll need to work through, the ability then to access patients from regional parts of Australia and the world and involve them in research is certainly far greater. So the overall view will be that, yes, we can act patients, we can start up our trials, but when it comes to monitoring, if we're able to do that remotely, if we're able to smarten up some of our processes to do monitoring in real time, it can actually accelerate some of the stage gates, particularly in early phase research, that are going to enable us to make decisions on trials in the way that we move forward.
Excellent, Ben. Thank you.
And Mel, just to
Yes.
add to that, it's Meg. Just to add to that, I think one of the challenges is in the healthcare system in itself, in that we don't have a national EMR. We don't have the ability for the person's treating doctor to actually then, if we make things totally remote, to be then having input into that person being on a clinical trial in an effective way. So I think at a country level, we need to think about that. You know, we've all tried to break down the borders of the states, but it's something that needs to be thought about, a big picture about how we do remote clinical trials in Australia, because it's not just as easy as saying you advertise or you go and you have web-based recruitment. It's not that simple because of the way that the healthcare system is set up.
No, really good response, Megan. That actually answers Kevin's question about a national EMR, and I think it's certainly something that we need to be discussing at a national level, because it is a significant impediment. Okay, Kylie, over to you. What practical measures do you see in research relating to risk mitigation and management?
Thanks, Mel. And I'm going to respond to this with three features. I think a number of speakers today have spoken about the cultural change that we've seen across the sector. And to be honest, actually, when my reflection on that actually is that we're a sector that deals with risk, has always dealt with risk. You know, whether you're sites, sponsors, investigators, as a sector, we've been very good at managing, assessing, mitigating clinical risk, research risk. And I think that has placed this sector well for this COVID environment. And what we've actually seen now is, across the board, really tangible and active risk assessment, risk monitoring, and risk mitigation. And that's at all levels of the sector. So whether it's, we've heard about, you know, really robust business continuity plans at sites, whether it's practical safety measures that we've seen put in place in site management approaches and in protocols, or indeed whether it's monitoring approaches. So I think the first is really, we have seen absolutely really tangible and active risk monitoring, and I think that bodes well for the sector. Kind of following on from that, the second point I would make is that in terms of practical measures, we've seen some flexibility about how these measures are actually managed in conversation between the ethics committee and the site and investigators. So, for example, you know, we've seen a very frequent approach has been to put an amendment onto the protocol. And this again comes to this kind of question of flexibility and adaptability. So increasingly we're seeing, you know, actually addendum plans that talk about alternative approaches, and actually outline when those approaches will be used based on the status at the time. And there's a really good, you know, broad recognition that actually in the time ahead, for however long this goes, the reality is we're probably all going to have to move from one position and back out and maybe back in again and back out. We hope that Victoria gets out soon, Ben. But I think that kind of adaptability compared to the old kind of set and forget approach is really the second kind of practical measure. And I think adding to Peter Kamoki's list about what I hope to see, you know, at the end of this, is that this kind of sector capability and can-do approach, I ideally hope is something that persists. I think it's really served the sector well. And then the final thing I would mention, the third aspect, is dual sourcing. Now, many of our sponsor organisations, again, have been, you know, very well used to dual sourcing, you know, certainly in GMP manufacturing. But again, I think we've now seen that deployed across research as well. So whether it's sites, you know, Megan talked about having dual approaches to pathology. But equally, you know, at the other end of the scale, we've seen sponsors establishing backup jurisdictions, you know, again, with almost anticipating a change. You know, so we're going to look at locating our trial, but from the outset, we're going to plan for the fact that this wave, this roller coaster, is going to go for a while yet, and we can, you know, proactively get ahead of that.
Thanks, Kylie, as always, very thoughtful and considered, and we appreciate your input. I've got a question for you there, and I know this is not a straightforward answer, but it comes from Sophie, who's asked, so are ethics committees likely to agree an amendment for our clinical trial to move from face-to-face consent to e-consent over Zoom? This would help our trial a lot. And again, I know that this is not a straightforward answer, but do you want to give it a go, Kylie?
Yeah, no, I'm actually really happy to. I mean, of course, the caveats are, I don't know which particular trial, so I don't know the nuances if, you know, there's particular vulnerabilities for participants, or, you know, we talked about the equity of access issue. So I don't know, this is obviously general comments, not related to the specific study. I clearly also have to say, I can certainly speak on behalf of the Bellberry ethics committees. And, you know, frankly, I think across the country, you'll find a similar response from other ethics committees, but obviously I'm not formally speaking for everybody. But I do think everybody in the sector is fully engaged with trying to make all of this work and focusing on what's best for the participant. So I'd almost be asking the ethics committee question, and the ethics committee the question of why wouldn't we? You know, particularly if you're in a location where there is evidence of community transmission, then, you know, actually prepare your discussion for the ethics committee in terms of why you want to take that approach, how you're going to implement it, and you know, that kind of balance for the safety of the participant. You know, on the one hand, it might make things like assessing understanding of information potentially harder, but on the other hand, you know, it reduces the exposure risk to COVID. And at the ethics committee, I'm almost certain will have a conversation, and there are lots and lots of examples where that has been accepted. Final caveat is, you've also specifically asked the question about Zoom. There are lots of different ways of doing remote consent. So again, I'm not commenting particularly on the Zoom tool. You know, just being open to potentially using others might well also get around that issue.
And Sophie, just to add to that, you should also explore in your institution what's available. Yes. Because if you've got an intensive care, they will actually have a process for end of life organ donation discussions that is remote, and you can just adopt that process, and that will help you with the ethics committee as well, because it's a proven methodology that has been utilised within your institution.
Absolutely, and that was going to be my suggestion, to just to build on what Kylie and Megan have said, is make sure you have that discussion with your research ethics committee. Ask them what they need from you to be able to support that submission, so that you can provide some robust rationales, and also speak to other colleagues from within your jurisdiction or from in similar organisations that might deal with the same ethics committee or RGO that you do, and get some ideas about their experience. All right, let's keep moving. We've got three more questions. If anybody needs to drop out, that's fine, including our panelists. But otherwise, we'll stay on board for a bit longer and just make sure that we can get through some of these questions. So over to you, Tina. And this one is a really important discussion that we have touched on today about harnessing the public's increased awareness of clinical trials beyond this COVID period, and how can we do that effectively and maintain that momentum?
Yes, I want to start off by saying that it's interesting that the biggest issue that came out from the first poll that you took today was about recruitment. And I think that ties in nicely with awareness of what clinical trials are. And pre-COVID, if we look at the Australian population and community, we would turn on the 6 o'clock news, and I know down in Melbourne here there would always be 1 or 2 stories about a clinical trial, a device, a new compound that was being progressed and in clinical trials to increase awareness or for recruitment, right? But I can honestly say I never ever remember a time in my career, such as now, where on the front page of every newspaper every day, on the news bulletin on the radio, on the 6 o'clock news, we start off with clinical trials. So the public have never been as aware of what clinical research is, what it means, what it involves, how long it takes, why it costs so much. And we've got this fabulous opportunity to harness it. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and we see that, all of us, I guess, on social media. But by the same token, we are a strong community. We have, I feel, the building blocks, the ethics governance, the site capabilities, the CROs, the want from the public to be involved generally. And we just need to piece that all together. It's not going to be easy because change isn't easy. But I think if we keep doing what we're doing and keep having these discussions as a community where we bring to the forefront what we need to change, how we can do it and find a way forward in a collaborative manner, then we will change for the better, and we will be able to bring more of these products and trials to the public and bring them with us. Again, I want to reiterate that in pretty much every protocol and project that we put together within our company now involves some type of advocacy group from that particular, be it a rare disease, a neurological disease, be it COVID. We have discussions not only with the sponsors and the regulators, but with the advocacy groups. And I'm thinking that increased awareness can be harnessed in all of the aspects I've just spoken about. And I'm going to stop there because I know we have a few more questions and not enough time.
Yeah, and look, I'm going to open up to some of the audience questions. So Sean has a question here for Peter, and it's around digital platforms for remote monitoring. And how can sites ensure security of these platforms, especially for those that are not endorsed by trial sponsors, and reduce the element of risk to the organisation? Peter, are you happy to chat to that, or is anybody else happy to chat to security of digital platforms?
I can start, but I will require assistance from those more technically astute than me. All I can say at this point is that there has been, quite a wide variety of take-up of this sort of stuff, and probably the best advice I could give, other than you folks can help me on, is to discuss amongst other sites of what's happening and it's been kept secure.
Sorry, you're a bit bumpy. It might be worth turning your video off while you're chatting. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I do know that a wide variety of IT platforms has been taken up. I'm not aware as to which ones are the preferred options, so perhaps the folks on the call you might be able to provide some insight. It certainly has been brought to my attention the security of this platform thus far is in question. It's more a matter of how to, at least in the remote monitoring sense, I believe the issue how to restrict access to just clinical trial participants, and some platforms would let others and not so much. And I know that in the public sector, it's a bit of an issue in that the software isn't being taken up quite as quickly as required.
So we did have a question about which platforms are being used. Bear with me while I find it. Okay, so this is from Janelle as well. So, and another great question. So what platforms are the various site and sponsors, and those of our panelists, using to conduct their remote patient visits? So is it just an adaptation of your current or your in-house platforms, or are you actually using other platforms that are teletrials or virtual trials specific?
Mel, I can take this one if you like.
Thanks,
from a Southwestern Sydney's perspective, the LHD implemented a platform, so we're utilising that platform. There are many platforms available though that are out there, and I think it really, if we want clinical trials to be part of everyday care for our patients and just something that, you know, becomes part of routine care, then I think we have to look at adopting what is in the institutions where we're running those clinical trials.
Excellent, thanks Meg, because the platforms that are available typically come from the US when we're thinking about virtual trials, and as we're moving to more virtual trials or hybrid trials, and they can be very cost prohibitive. So it's reassuring to know that many of the health jurisdictions have the platforms available. So let's just keep going with our next question. And Ben, this is over to you again. So what should sponsors and sites be considering when establishing remote medical record access and completing remote source data monitoring? And again, I think this is a really key question because it was one of the key factors that people identified.
Yeah, and I think Peter's touched on a couple of key points there in terms of the systems that people are adopting and IT security. So I won't cover that again. Suffice to say that from a sponsor organisation, you know, IT security, where we're having networks connected and the ability for you know, for viruses and for other nasties to infiltrate is certainly a big factor when considering these solutions, particularly if it requires the sponsor organisation or CRO to download software. So that's probably some of the challenges that we're seeing now, that people are being a bit cautious there. I guess up front, what I'd say is that for a site, and for a sponsor, we want to be thinking to the future as much as we can. I think early on in the pandemic, we looked at reacting to surviving, you know, critical data points and key studies. But as we move forward, I think it's about the future. So yeah, if you're developing an EMR or e-source system, making sure that it covers compliance, making sure that you're clear about the extent of source data and what can be accessed remotely and what can't, and the access. I think for sponsors, it's about tech, but also around process. So you know, critical things for us is to make sure that we're really clear on how we report data breaches, that we don't slip up here and cause the industry to go backwards. But also thinking that around future state and what's the right makeup of your clinical team. Knowing that SDV is a key component of what we do, but it's certainly not everything. So how do we continue to oversee quality? How do we continue to have that connectivity between CRAs and sites? And how do we support broader trial activities such as recruitment remotely? I think are really important questions beyond just the SDV.
Yeah, really good reflections there, Ben. Thank you. All right, we have gone a little over, but I'm just going to finish up with two quick questions. Again, whoever needs to drop out can drop out. But this first one is from Brian, who's asked, are we monitoring for participant fatigue and duplication of similar trials? And I think Kylie alluded to that in her question. But does any of the panel want to answer how they are managing that?
Mel, we've taken a central approach to our clinical trials, particularly the COVID clinical trials, and I do think it's a big risk. Also, you know, if you've got different clinical trial teams contacting those COVID positive patients, it can actually get quite confusing. So having that centralised approach has been really effective. I think there is fatigue in some areas outside of the COVID clinical trials, and that fatigue isn't necessarily from being from being offered too many clinical trials. It's fatigue from having to adapt to what's happening, and actually, you know, we've changed a lot of processes and procedures for people on these studies. So there is fatigue out there, and it's something that everybody needs to be aware of and really manage at a sponsor level and at a site level.
Thanks, Megan. And just the final question, I think this is a really pragmatic but important question, and it relates to fully virtual trials or hybrid models where they are siteless, either by design or by need, where visits are completely remote and conducted in people's homes. Is the home being treated as a satellite site?
I can give that one a crack. No is probably the short answer. So I guess when we're talking about a satellite site, we're talking around that as an institution for conducting research, and typically there's a need to assess that site, or for that site to be auditable. In a virtual setting, I don't see the home as being a satellite site, although what we will see is the various functions around the home. So it might be a local lab, it might be a local imaging centre, it might be a provider of home nursing services. You know, those would be effective satellite vendors that we will need to make sure that we're accredited and that we're covering off on you know, key quality and oversight of those facilities. So yeah, I think we're going to see more satellite sites, but it won't necessarily be the home as such.
And I would 100% agree with that as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
the issue is going to be identification of who the person is. That is our biggest concern, and establishing, you know, that participant, making sure that they are who they say they are. That's one of the risks, I guess, of that setting. Yeah.
That's right. I would just add to that the you know, a satellite site by definition, at least within this context, is a contracted site, a contracted service provider. So we're here to just some contractual obligations of delivering and helping with the delivery of the trial. Whereas my home doesn't do that. If I was the patient, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, sorry, muted. Does the panel have any final comments that they would like to make mention of? Otherwise, we might close out.
Just a thank you from me to you and the panelists and everybody that's been asking questions and listening in. Keep up the work, everyone.
And I similarly would like to thank you all. It's just, you know, what a fabulous panel of people to have on today's discussion. I've certainly had a number of text messages whilst we've been running the session, thanking us for having such great speakers. So we thank you. We thank everybody that joined us today, and we look forward to talking to you again for future sessions over coming weeks. We've got a session on e-consent coming up very shortly, so do join that conversation. So we'll leave it there. We will try to get some answers to some of the questions that are quite specific offline and send them back to you personally. But again, thank you all. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.